Hey guys, tonight we slip beneath the flickering lamps of 1920s. Paris where jazz trumpets stutter through cigarette smoke. The same glimmers like melted mercury. And somewhere in the shadows, someone ties off a silk ribbon, ready for a different kind of intoxication. You're not here for romance. Not really, you're here for the heroin craze that pulsed quietly beneath the city's heartbeat. This is a tale of velvet nights, velvet needles, and a Paris that dressed its despair in sequins and perfume. You probably won't survive this particular decade, not if you keep up with the pace of the Parisians. With all euphoria came in powder form. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere far away, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing who's awake with me now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step out of the Gare Saint-Lazare just as twilight settles. The streets pulse with laughter, saxophones, and the rustle of evening dresses. Paris has survived a war, barely. Soldiers who once lay in trenches now lounge in cafes, their medals traded for morphine. The city tells itself it's reborn, but you can feel it, can't you? That soft hum beneath the gaiety, the sense that everyone's just trying to forget something. You wander into Montparnasse, where American jazz musicians melt into French poets, and the absinthe is flowing like gossip. Someone passes you a cigarette that doesn't quite smell like tobacco. Try it, they whisper. It's cleaner than liquor. That's the pitch of the decade. Modern intoxication, scientific pleasure. Heroin isn't a gutter drug, yet it's a laboratory miracle. Bayer, the same folks who gave the world aspirin, launched it back in 1898 as a cough remedy. A little heroin in your tonic water, they promised, and you'd sleep like a saint. By the 1920s, the marketing sheen has faded, but the habit hasn't. You duck into a cafe called Le Bal Nagar, where the walls vibrate with drumming. A woman in feathers spins, laughing like she's trying to chase away her own shadow. The patrons aren't just drinking, they're dosing. Little white envelopes trade hands under tables. The powder moves as easily as conversation. Paris, the city of light, has found a darker glow. Outside, taxis sputter past. Newsboys shout headlines about new dance crazes and rising art prices. Beneath the chatter, whispers circulate. Soldiers using morphine to sleep. Artists chasing visions through heroin's haze. It's all perfectly Parisian, the mix of intellect, tragedy, and a touch of sin. Historians still argue whether this heroin wave was truly widespread or just a bohemian fashion statement magnified by gossip. But in the half-lit cafes, it doesn't feel small. It feels contagious. You follow a young writer, then adds a cigarette to a garret overlooking the rooftops. He tells you that heroin opens the window to the divine. You look at his trembling hands and wonder how divine the window really is. On the floor lies a sketchbook filled with jittery drawings of angels, smoke, and railway tunnels. He laughs when you glance at it. Everyone here's chasing the next version of heaven, he says, and some of us are running late. Paris in 1920 is like a party held inside a wound. The Great War has ended, but the trauma hasn't. Half the men still limp. The other half pretend not to. Hospitals that once treated shrapnel wounds now dispense morphine for nerves. A few patients never stop returning for their prescription refills. Some say that's where the heroin craze began, not in the cabarets, but in the clinics, among doctors trying to soothe the nation's insomnia. You cross the Seine, watching reflections tremble. Somewhere behind you, laughter erupts too loud, too desperate. The whole city seems caught in a nervous giggle, the kind people use to cover grief. The street lamps gleam like watchful eyes. Every few blocks, you see another pharmacy sign glowing green. Another queue of respectable Parisians buying tonic drops. It's a strange mixed respectability and recklessness sharing the same glass. Heroin is still sold legally, though regulations are tightening. Ads promise soothing rest and clean exhilaration. Doctors write prescriptions with a wink, and you can't help noticing how easily Paris turns vice into fashion. In this city, even addiction comes with an aesthetic. A famous cafe gossip columnist, think the 1920s version of a TikTok influencer, writes about the heroin girls. Chic young women who carry their syringes in silver cases, nestled beside their lipstick. It's shocking, but also uncomfortably glamorous. Paris has always known how to sell beauty, even when it's self-destructive. You lean against a lamppost in here, begale, and watch a jazz band load their instruments after a gig. The drummer, wiping sweat from his brow, mutters that heroin helps him keep tempo. The trumpeter just grins, keeps the notes floating. You laugh. Softly, it's a joke, but maybe not. In the corner, a stray dog noses through discarded cigarette papers and finds a glinting spoon. The city's detritus sparkles like treasure. Somewhere, a siren wails, maybe a police cart, maybe just an ambulance. Paris doesn't pause. It dances through the noise. A quirky little tidbit. Some apothecaries back then sold heroin lozenges flavored with vanilla, supposedly for public singers and orators. Imagine a jazz crooner popping one before a set, calling it medicine. Ain't it sense? Everyone's voice is medicated. You step into another cafe, this one quiet, lamplit, smelling of coffee and ink. A poet named Pierre reads his verses aloud, his words trembling between brilliance and breakdown. He's on something, you can tell. He calls it my silver muse. His audience claps like believers at a sermon. Later, he collapses in the alley, and his friends call for a doctor who arrives with ironically morphine syringe. Paris heals with the same poison that sickens it. By midnight, the city's tempo slows. Lovers walk the bridges, carriages rattle home, and the moon stains the rooftops like spilled milk. You realize this isn't just a craze, it's a coping mechanism, a collective lullaby for a nation afraid to wake up. Historians still argue whether heroin in the 1920s was primarily an artistic tool or a social epidemic, whether its spread was romantic myth or measurable crisis. But to you, standing here among the jazz notes and jittery laughter, it feels real enough. You can almost hear the sighs of those who came here looking for freedom and found dependency instead. And yet, there's beauty, too. The music, the art, the wild insistence on feeling alive after so much death. Maybe that's what makes Paris in this moment so intoxicating. It's a city trying to prove it still has a pulse. You exhale. Somewhere, a gramophone crackles out the faint notes of La Vie en Rose. You watch the stars fade into the smoke and think, in this city, even despair dances. You wake horn. Maybe you've never slept in a room that smells of rain and cigarette butts. The curtains are drawn tight, but sunlight seeps through anyway, slicing the air into pale ribbons. You can hear the clatter of the street outside, vendors shouting, tram grinding its metal teeth, someone laughing too loudly. Paris is alive, gay, but its laughter has that brittle edge that only comes from surviving something unspeakable. You wander out and follow the rhythm of footsteps toward the boulevards. It's been just a few years since the Great War ended, and the ghosts haven't left. They ride the buses beside you, limbless veterans in long coats, their faces half hidden under hats. You catch their eyes, sometimes pale, exhausted, but oddly polite, and you realize they're the ones who brought heroin home. Not on purpose, of course. Doctors prescribed morphine by the crate during the war, for pain, for sleep, for courage. When the guns fell silent, the knee didn't. The body still remembered the comfort of numbness. You stop at a cafe where the chalkboard menu boasts chocolate, calf, morphine. A bad joke maybe, but one that gets a few nervous chuckles. Inside, a man with a wooden leg plays cards with two others who wear medals under their jackets. They sip cognac, and talk about them on as if it happened yesterday. Every so often, one of them rubs his arm where the bandages used to be, and you can almost hear the phantom ache whisper, "Okay, just one more shot." There's a mainstream fact here that no one really argues after 1918. France faced one of Europe's worst morphine addiction waves. Pharmacies couldn't keep up with demand, and the black market bloomed like mold. What started as medicine for shattered soldiers became leisure for restless civilians. By the early 1920s, heroin slid neatly into the gap, smaller doses for the same escape. You keep walking through Montparnasse, and it feels like every wall carries a memory. Posters still cling to corners, advertising victory parades long since over. Beneath the slogans, La France triumphant, someone scrawled a croix bon. What's the point? It's the unofficial motto of the decade. Historians still argue whether the post-war despair directly caused the heroin surge, or if the two merely coexisted in the same anxious bloodstream. Maybe it wasn't cause and effect, but a kind of emotional rhyme. A nation craving anesthesia for wounds that weren't visible. You pass a hospital, Hospital St. Louis, one of the oldest in the city. Its tall gates are shut, but through the bars, you spot a nurse carrying trays of medicine bottles. The labels blurred together: ether, chloroform, morphine, heroin. They all promise peace in neat glass containers. Inside, you imagine soldiers in their 30s who still call out for comrades long buried. Nurses who have stopped writing home because there's nothing new to say except they're still suffering. One of the nurses steps out for a cigarette. She catches your eye and shrugs. "They think they're cured," she says softly, "but they only traded one kind of war for another." Outside, the city pretends at celebration. You find yourself in front of the Folly Burger, its marquee flashing promises of laughter, sequence, and scandal. The queue is long. Everyone's here to drown out the silence that creeps in between champagne bubbles. Inside, the performers shimmy and sparkle, but backstage word has it there's a quiet epidemic. Dancers share powder. Musicians inject in the corners. One stagehand jokes that the real curtain call is when someone finally passes out. Here's your quirky tidbit. A few French soldiers returning from the front carried heroin kits issued by medical officers, complete with sterilized syringes, morphine tablets, and a small bottle of Bayer's new wonder drug. They were meant for emergencies, but soldiers joked they were for moral emergencies, too. Paris just inherited that humor and never quite let it go. You slip into a little bookstore where a gray-haired owner leans over his counter, reading Proust. The air smells like dust and paper. On the shelf behind him sits a half-empty bottle of laudanum. You ask if it helps him sleep. "Sleep," he laughs. "I'm not sure I want to anymore." His eyes soften. The young ones, they take the heroin to dream. We older ones take it to stop remembering. It's Paris in a single sentence. A generation that can't decide whether to forget or to feel. You think of the veterans who can't stand the sound of fireworks. The widows who wear pearls to funerals. The artists who find beauty only in decay. The city hides its grief well, dressing it in music. Jazz has arrived courtesy of African American bands who find in Paris a kind of freedom America still denies them. Their rhythm infects everything, even the pharmacies. A few drugstores sponsor jazz nights now, because why not? Medicine and melody both promise the same thing: relief. You pause near the Seine, watching the water ripple. Across the bridge, you spot a group of young men tossing pebbles into the river. One of them recites lines from Apollinaire, the war poet who died too soon. The others nod, like acolytes. He understood. One says, "Pain is holy if you make art of it." Another laughs, pulling a small packet from his pocket. "Then, let's make art." You don't stay to see what happens next. The newspapers of the time are filled with contradiction. One page warns of heroin's moral decay, while the next advertises heroin tablets for fatigue and female troubles. The era in a nutshell. The problem and the prescription printed side by side. Doctors publicly condemn addiction while quietly prescribing the same drugs to their wealthiest patients as dusk falls. You wander into a public garden where pigeons coo in the trees. A little boy feeds them breadcrumbs, his mother watching nearby with a look that's half love, half worry. She catches your gaze and forces a smile. Maybe she's one of the many women taking tonic ampules laced with opiates, sold as a cure for hysteria. Paris pharmacies were full of such solution-soothing syrups that soothed a little too well. You walk on. The sky bruises into purple. Somewhere, a gramophone plays a slow Charleston. You can almost see the silhouettes of dancers in the apartment windows, spinning, laughing, falling onto couches. The laughter echoes across rooftops, thin and lovely and desperate. One of the evening's jokes, quiet, dark, but human, comes from a painter you meet leaning against a wall, smudged with charcoal. The war took my brother, he says, and heroin took the silence afterward. It's only fair. You can't tell if he's being profound or just tired. Probably both, as the streetlights flicker on. Paris feels suspended between forgetting and feeling, between morphine and melody. Every corner hums with the residue of the war of the hospitals. The half-empty bottles, the jittery jazz beats. You pause on a bridge, feeling the cool iron under your palms. Below, the Seine moves like liquid glass, reflecting all that pain and beauty at once. The city breathes uneven, shallow, but alive. For now, you head down the hill toward Montmartre, the heart of what people like to call Bohemia. Though by now, the word's been worn thin by overuse. Once it meant poverty and rebellion. Now it mostly means a place where rich kids play at being poor while drinking imported champagne. Still, you can't deny the pulse here it beats beneath every cobblestone. The air smells like roasted chestnuts, stale beer, and perfume strong enough to outlast heartbreak. You can practically taste the century-changing dot at the corner of Rue Lepic. A cabaret called Le Rat Mort buzzes like an electric hive. You slip inside and are hit by sound. Laughter that's too loud. Jazz that's just slightly offbeat. Clinking glasses and the faint crackle of a gramophone fighting for attention. The crowds are collage painters in threadbare coats beside debutantes in sequined dresses. American expatriates rubbing elbows with Parisian philosophers. Someone's always sketching, someone's always singing, and someone's always discreetly nodding off at the edge of the table. Heroin doesn't carry stigma, here not yet. It's not a back alley secret, but a kind of shorthand for sophistication. You smoke? Someone might ask, meaning not cigarettes, but the new imported habit of vaporizing powder on foil. Of course, comes a reply, as if they'd been asked whether they liked jazz. You can almost see the city's arteries expanding with each exhale. A waitress with crimson lips glides past, setting down drinks that sparkle like chemistry experiments. You overhear the poets debating whether euphoria is just another word for forgetfulness. No, says one, it's clarity. It's what the saints must feel right before they dissolve. You smile poets always talk like that before falling asleep in their wine. Here's your historical. Anchor, by the mid-1920s. Paris had hundreds of cafes and nightclubs openly serving customers under the influence. Authorities knew, of course, but enforcement was soft, the law still uncertain. The League of Nations had begun pushing global narcotics controls, but France lagged behind, too enamored with its myth of creative freedom. The heroin flowed as easily as the coffee. You find yourself drawn to a table where a trio of Americans jazz musicians, by the look of them, are tuning up between sets. One wipes his trumpet and says, "Paris, don't judge." Back home, they'd throw us out for just breathing wrong. His friend grins. Here, they just ask what key you're in and what you're on. You can't help laughing, because in this place, Both questions matter equally. A quirky tidbit floats through conversation. Rumor has it that certain cabarets used to mix traces of opium in their hookah tobacco, calling it the Oriental touch. Nobody's sure if it's true or just another bit of nightlife marketing, but the story travels faster than any fact sheet ever could. Paris thrives on rumors, cheaper than advertising and twice as addictive. You drift toward the stage as the band begins. The trumpets wail, the drums chatter, and a woman in a backless dress starts to dance. She's magnetic, almost liquid, her movements sliding between ecstasy and exhaustion. The audience roars. You notice the fine tremor in her hands when she bows. Someone whispers her name, Claudine. She's one of the city's white ladies, not for her skin, but for the color of her powder. She laughs between breaths, blows a kiss to no one in particular, and disappears backstage, where, you imagine, the glow fades into a different kind of silence. Historians still argue whether heroin truly shaped the art of the decade or merely haunted its fringes. Was it the secret muse behind surrealisms, dreamscapes, and jazz's improvisations, or just another coincidence of chaos? The truth probably lies somewhere between. You can't separate inspiration from intoxication in a city that lives for sensation. You wander back to your table and order a coffee so strong it feels like penance. Across the room, a painter is sketching on a napkin. He invites you to look jagged lines, all elbows and smoke, like the human form refracted through glass. That's what the music feels like, he says, sharp and endless. You ask if he uses heroin too. He shrugs. Only when I need to stop thinking. Things to be everyone's reason, and also their undoing. Another table. A playwright rehearses dialogue with his actors, slurring slightly. His latest script, he says, is about a man who can't tell if he's dreaming or dying. Same difference. Someone jokes. Everyone laughs too hard. There's a rhythm to it, kind of communal denial that makes the air feel thick and sparkling. Midnight approaches, and the crowd swells. You squeeze through the dance floor, watching couples sway in a trance. One woman's pearls snap, scattering across the floor. Nobody helps her pick them up. They just keep dancing over them, the beads crunching softly under shoes. Paris has no time for sentimentality tonight. You step outside for air. The street glows with lamplight, the cobblestones slick from a recent drizzle. Somewhere, a gramophone spills out a slow waltz. The city smells like rain and risk. You lean against the wall beside a young man in an oversized coat, his eyes half-lidded, but still kind. You new here? He asks. You nod. Then let me give you advice, he says. Don't mistake peace for pleasure. They feel similar at first. Smiles, and you realize his pupils are pinpoints. You thank him and step away before his wisdom curdles into tragedy. A car splashes past, and you catch sight of an advertisement painted on its side, Hero Knee Buyer. Poor law to ET less nerves. Hero in 4 coughs in nerves. It's 1924, and the slogan still isn't illegal. The city, for all its brilliance, it's like a child playing with matches in a fireworks factory. You make your way downhill toward Pagale, where the lights grow harsher and the laughter rougher. The clubs here cater to the desperate rather than the dazzling. On a narrow street, a door opens briefly, spilling out a cloud of smoke and the sound of someone shouting in English. Play it again, Louis. The door slams and silence rushes in like water. You pause near a poster that reads Dongs, Musique, Mistar, and below it, in small print, Pharmacy, ACT. The proximity isn't coincidence. Nightlife and narcotics share a wall, sometimes a doorway. A few steps separate revelry from relief. As you walk, the laughter fades, replaced by the hiss of rain. You think of how fragile all this feels, the glamour, the art, the illusions propped up by little envelopes of powder. Yet there's a strange dignity in it too, the way people insist on creating beauty, even while falling apart. And because every story here deserves at least one joke. You remember overhearing a taxi driver say, Paris runs on 3 fuels, coffee, gossip, and morphine. Only the first one's taxed. He wasn't wrong by the time you reach your small, rented room overlooking the rooftops. The city is quiet, except for the echo of jazz drifting through the damp air. You sit by the window, watching the first hints of dawn spread over the chimneys. The night has been both intoxicating and sobering, a perfect contradiction. Like Paris itself, you wonder how long this balance can hold. How long the cafes can keep their shimmer before the cracks begin to show. For now, though, the city exhales, and you with it. Somewhere, a trumpet hits its last note, clean and trembling. You close your eyes and let the silence hum. Morning again, though it's hard to tell. Paris light always looks a little hungover. You stretch, rubbing the sleep from your eyes, and glance out the window. Delivery carts rattle past, clinking with bottles. Shopkeepers lift their shutters like eyelids. The city's waking up to another day of pretending it isn't addicted to anything. You wander toward the left bank, where the boulevards are cleaner, the cafes a little more respectable. This is the realm of pharmaceutical glamour, different kind of high, polished and perfumed. Forget the smoky cabarets of Montmartre for now. This is where the bourgeois come to get their medicine. The shop windows glitter with glass bottles. The labels written in neat cursive: elixir, demorphine, syrup hero Q, powder, anti-Nero geek. They gleam like jewelry, lined up beside soaps and face creams. You push open the door of one pharmacy, a bell chiming overhead. Inside, it smells of lavender, alcohol, and the faint metallic temps of antiseptic. The pharmacist's white coat, waxed mustache, the posture of a man who believes in chemistry the way priests believe in miracles, greets you with a polite nod. He's not a dealer, not really, but he knows what his regulars want. A woman in a mink stole leans on the counter, whispering for her tonic. The pharmacist nods, disappears, and returns with a small brown bottle labeled simply drops for nerves. You catch the faint word, diacetylmorphine, printed in tiny letters beneath. She tucks it into her purse as if it were perfume. My husband thinks it's valerian, she says to no one in particular, smiling to the mainstream historical fact here. Throughout the early 1920s, heroin and morphine were still legally available in French pharmacies with only minimal oversight. The same Bayer brand that sold aspirin also offered heroin tablets marketed for coughs and menstrual pain. It was seen as elegant medicine, not moral decay. Addiction wasn't a vice. It was a symptom of sophistication. You browse the shelves, pretending not to notice how every other customer avoids eye contact. One young man in a tailored suit fidgets with his hat brim. The pharmacist slides him a package wrapped in wax paper. No questions asked. You realize these transactions are a kind of choreography, rehearsed and discreet. No one's fooling anyone, but everyone pretends otherwise. There's even a touch of glamour to the instruments themselves. Needles come in velvet-lined cases, syringes engraved with initials, and tiny spoons made of silver. The wealthy can afford to turn their habits into accessories. One Parisian magazine even ran a tongue-in-cheek feature titled, Les Bijoux Medicinaux Medical Jewelry, displaying jeweled ampule holders and gold-plated syringes for the lady of refined constitution. Mean, you can't help but grin at the absurdity. Imagine Cartier advertising a limited morphine edition. Paris will turn anything into fashion if you give it a ribbon. The pharmacist catches your amused look and smirks. People prefer their sins sterile, he says. Then he offers you a sample vial of something labeled L. Antonivro Gigbear for headaches, explains, eyes twinkling. You slip it into your pocket, though you don't intend to use it. The label alone feels like history. You leave the shop and step into the crisp air. Across the street, billboard shows a smiling woman holding a glass of tonic water, Santé Moderne. Pour les nerfs, pour la vie. Modern health, for nerves, for life. You have to hand it to the advertisers. They made escape look wholesome. Here's your quirky tidbit. One Parisian department store, Cleef stocked heroin pastilles in its luxury section alongside imported teas, marketed to tired ladies and traveling gentlemen. They came in decorative tins, perfect for handbags. By the time officials noticed, the tins had already become collectors' items among the avant-garde. You wander further down the boulevard and duck into a tea salon, the kind where writers and editors linger. The clink of china competes with murmured gossip. At the next table, two journalists debate whether drug use should be seen as a public health concern or simply a private eccentricity of the artistic class. The first insists it's a disease. The second shrugs. Everything in Paris is a disease: romance, poetry, democracy. They clink teacups and toast to that diagnosis. Historians still argue whether this period marked the height of medical negligence or the last gasp of old world pharmacology before regulation. France's narcotics law of 1916 technically restricted heroin, but enforcement was laughable. Doctors could still prescribe it for almost any ailment, and pharmacies rarely checked credentials. The black market wasn't even necessary when the white market was this accommodating. You can almost sense the contradiction breathing through the city. The same culture that prizes intellect and restraint also worships indulgence. Heroin straddles the divide perfectly, science packaged as surrender. You step back outside. A light rain begins, dotting your coat. You find shelter under an awning where a perfume ad shows a woman's profiles closed, lips parted, a fine mist of scent suspended in the air. The tagline reads, "Respirez la beauté, breathe beauty." You think of how easily that slogan could apply to everything else. Paris inhales. A middle-aged man beside you offers a cigarette. They say the English are banning heroin entirely, he mutters. Typical, no imagination. You raise an eyebrow. You don't think it's dangerous? He chuckles. Life's dangerous. This just makes it prettier. He tips his hat and strolls off into the drizzle, whistling a cabaret tune. You continue walking, passing apothecaries like way stations, one another little temple of chemistry and denial. Inside one, a clerk dusts bottles with reverence. In another, a doctor in pince-nez glasses argues with a patient about dosage, his voice tired but firm. It helps you sleep, yes, he says, but it also helps you forget why you can't. You don't catch the rest, but the words linger as evening falls. The gaslights flicker on, turning the raindrops into tiny stars. Paris sparkles, wet and restless. The pharmacies close one by one, but behind their locked doors, the bottles wait like sleeping serpents. You pass a group of fashionable young women, laughing beneath umbrellas, their voices bright as champagne. One waves a compact mirror, joking, powder for the face, powder for the soul. Everyone laughs. You do too, because humor, even dark humor, is how Paris breathes. By the time you reach your room, the streets have quieted. The scent of wet stone fills the air. You sit by the window and think about all those immaculate bottles lined up behind polished glass. Their beauty disguising something that will soon turn ruinous. For now, though, it's still luxury, still legal, still lovely. You can almost hear the pharmacist's bell as the door swings open again tomorrow morning. Another customer, another whisper, another transaction sealed with civility. Paris will always find a way to make even its addictions look elegant. You wake to the slow rhythm of rain on the window panes. The city outside hums like a record spinning at half speed, muted, steady, melancholy. Today, you follow the scent of turpentine and tobacco toward the studios of Montparnasse, where art and addiction share the same canvas. The streets here are lined with cheap hotels, carrots stacked like haphazard thoughts, and cafes so crowded you could mistake them for confession booths. Everyone's guilty of something, and no one apologizes. You push open the door of Ladim Caf, where the chairs wobble and the tables are scuffed from decades of cigarette burns. The room is already full writers, painters, sculptors, philosophers, each trying to outsuffer the other. A thin woman with coal-smudged eyes is sketching on a napkin, her strokes fast and furious. Next to her, a man reads aloud from a notebook, his words tumbling like a fever dream. You realize they're not talking to each other. They're all talking through the fog. You order coffee and listen. The air feels thick with something unsaid. Half the people here are half awake, running on caffeine, cigarettes, and whatever else keeps the world from closing in. The line between revelation and relapse has blurred. A mainstream fact, first. Paris in the 1920s was a magnet for artists escaping prohibition, Puritanism, and the drab aftermath of the war. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Modigliani, Picasso, and countless others found sanctuary here. Many also found substances absinthe, opium, heroin ready to fuel whatever muse or madness they were chasing. To create without restraint meant living without restraint. And heroin offered that illusion in liquid form. You leave your cup half finished and wander through the back streets. Behind the cafe, a staircase leads up to a cluttered attic studio. Inside, canvases lean against the walls, faces melting into shapes, bodies dissolving into color. The painter, a lanky man named Arnaud, doesn't look up as you enter. His eyes are ringed with sleeplessness. "Don't step on that," he mutters, pointing at a syringe resting delicately atop a paint-stained rag. "That's my brush cleaner." You're not sure if he's joking? Probably not. He talks as he paints. "You know what heroin does?" asks. "It slows the heartbeat just enough for you to see the world breathing." You nod, though you're not convinced. His hands tremble as he adds a final stroke. The canvas shows a woman's face, luminous and tragic, eyes half closed as if caught between ecstasy and extinction. "That's my muse," he whispers. "She left last month. I can still smell her perfume in the syringe." You manage a half smile, unsure if you want sympathy or applause. Around here, those are often the same thing. Historians still argue whether the drug really inspired artists or merely anesthetized them, enough to keep working through exhaustion and grief. Some say heroin sharpened perception, others that it dulled it into oblivion. The debate, like the addiction itself, never resolves. Back on the street, you find another studio, this one belonging to a sculptor named Delphine, famous for molding angels out of scrap metal. She greets you barefoot, her apron streaked with clay. "Coffee," she offers. You notice a small bottle of medical drops beside the sugar bowl. She catches your glance and grins. "Don't worry, it's French medicine. It only kills boredom." She laughs softly, the sound both bright and broken. Delphine shows you her newest piece, a twisted angel, wings folded, face tilted toward the ground. "It's about grace falling," she says. "We all fall beautifully here. The city has a way of making tragedy look like choreography." A quirky tidbit. Some artists, especially among the surrealists, claimed heroin enhanced their visions during automatic drawing sessions where they sketched without conscious control. Andre Masson supposedly called it opening the mind's second eyelid. Of course, others said he was just very bad at staying awake. You leave the studio and head toward a nearby bar where jazz leaks through the cracks in the door. Inside, the smoke is so thick it could be sculpted. A small group of musicians hunch over their instruments, one on piano, one on bass, one with a trumpet so dented it looks like it's survived a war. You recognize the trumpet player from Montmartre. He's pale now, his eyes sunken but blazing when the music hits. He nods at you between sets. "You ever tried?" he asks quietly. "You know what it means?" You shake your head. He shrugs, makes the notes stretch, like you're playing underwater. Then, without warning, he lifts the trumpet again, and the sound that pours out is pure heartbreak slow, haunting, like a goodbye that never ends. When he finishes, the bar stays silent for a long moment before anyone claps. You think, maybe that's what the heroine does. It erases the wall between the player and the note, the painter and the brushstroke, the writer and the word. But it also erases everything else that makes them human. Later, you walk along Boulevard Raspail, where the streetlights shimmer through drizzle. The cafes glow like aquariums' faces, floating behind the glass, each haloed in smoke. You catch fragments of conversation. Genius, madness, inspiration. The words tumble together, indistinguishable. At a corner table, a young writer scratches furiously in his notebook. "I'm writing myself out of pain," he says, to no one in particular. You glance over his shoulder and read a line. "I am an experiment disguised as a man." You wonder how many in this city would agree. Historians still argue whether heroine's influence on 1920s Parisian art was romanticized by later generations, hungry for a tragic myth. Maybe the truth is simpler. Artists have always used what's available: paint, sound, words, drugs, to bridge the gap between feeling and expression. Heroin just happened to be the fashionable bridge of that decade. As you near your room, the rain picks up again. You duck under a canopy beside two painters sharing a cigarette. One jokes, "I only use heroin when I can't afford inspiration." The other laughs. Then you're broke and brilliant. It's the kind of joke that lands too close to home. The city feels both alive and dying at once. Paradox Paris wears like a silk scarf. From every studio window, a dim light flickers, each flame its own fragile rebellion against despair. You pause, looking up at the endless pattern of chimneys, silhouetted against the night. Somewhere behind those walls, a dozen artists chase beauty through smoke and stupor, believing the next canvas or melody will redeem them. You can almost hear their hearts slowing, sinking with the rhythm of the rain. You take a breath and whisper to yourself, "Paris paints with whatever it bleeds." And then, because this story always needs one last dark chuckle, a stray cat leaps onto a trash can beside you, startling you so much you swear. The cat blinks, unimpressed, and trots off toward the light of a nearby cafe. Even the strays here have better composure than most poets. The day begins with trumpet notes spiraling up from somewhere in Pagale bright, brassy, impossible to ignore. You follow the sound like a thread, winding through streets still slick with last night's rain. The air smells of roasted coffee, stale perfume, and the faint bitterness of ether drifting from a pharmacy's open window. You don't know where you're going yet, but Paris has a way of answering questions you haven't asked. The trumpet leads you to the Theatre des Champs-Élysées, where the marquee flashes the name Josephine Baker. Her face-wide smile, eyes alive with mischief, seems to wink at you, even from the poster. You've heard of her, of course. Everyone has. The woman who danced her way into history, wearing a skirt of bananas and an attitude of rebellion. But what most people don't realize is that beneath the glitter, Josephine's Paris hums with exhaustion. Every performance is a kind of exorcism, a way to dance through pain before it can swallow her whole. You buy a cheap ticket and slip inside. The theater smells of velvet, powder, and tension. The crowd is electric aristocrats in pearls, soldiers in uniform, journalists scribbling furiously. And somewhere, Jean Cocteau himself, lounging with a cigarette like a bored angel. The orchestra swells, the curtains rise, and there she is, Josephine, shimmering under the lights, movement incarnate. You can feel the audience collectively exhale the war wounds, the sleepless nights, the whispered addictions, all momentarily forgotten. Here's your mainstream fact. Josephine Baker became the icon of 1920s Paris, embodying both liberation and longing. Her performances broke racial barriers and electrified a generation starving for joy. But behind the stage lights, she also lived among circles where heroin, morphine, and opium flowed freely. The boundary between artistic energy and chemical escape was paper-thin. You watch her spin, leap, and laugh, but you notice something in her eyes edge of melancholy that doesn't quite fade, even at her brightest. Later, when she bows, the applause is thunderous, a physical force. Paris doesn't just admire her, it consumes her. After the show, the crowd spills into the lobby. You linger near the entrance where Cocteau is speaking softly to a friend. He looks ghostly pale, his cheekbones sharp as if sculpted from grief. He's one of those artists who always seems halfway between genius and collapse. He's also a known morphine addict, though the word addict feels too crude for someone. Writes like he's channeling dreamlight. You follow him into the cool air outside. He lights another cigarette, his hands trembling slightly. You enjoyed the performance? He asks, though his tone suggests he doesn't care about your answer. Paris needs her, he adds after a moment. She reminds us that life still moves. Then, quieter, I try to remember that when the medicine stops working. The medicine, of course, is an aspirin. Cocteau's journals are full of references to his morphine dependency, how it both inspired and imprisoned him. He once wrote, "My demon is sweet, white, and loyal." You can almost hear that phrase echoing in his voice now. The tenderness of someone describing a lover, who also happens to be the thing that's killing them. Historians still argue whether Cocteau's best worked the surrealism, the symbolism, the sheer strangeness was born from his drug use or in spite of it. Some say heroin gave him access to the subconscious. Others insist it dulled his brilliance. Maybe both are true. Art and addiction often dance together until you can't tell who's leading. You and Cocteau walk a few blocks in silence before he excuses himself, disappearing into a taxi. The night presses close. You drift toward a smaller club nearby, where the lights are dimmer and the laughter sharper. Inside, you find Josephine again, not on stage, but at a back table surrounded by admirers. She's out of costume now, in a simple dress, her hair slicked back, still radiant but softer, almost fragile. She's laughing, telling a story about rehearsing barefoot in the rain. Someone offers her a cigarette. She waves it off, smiling. No more smoke for me tonight. Only champagne. The table cheers. And yet you catch a flicker of weariness in her smile, the kind that comes from being everyone's symbol of joy, or quietly running out of it yourself. A quirky tidbit floats your way from a nearby conversation. Apparently, Cocteau once tried to cure his addiction by locking himself in a room for 10 days with nothing but paper, ink, and a cat for company. He claimed the cat was his guardian against despair. Kea, when he emerged, pale and shaking, he declared he'd been reborn and then promptly relapsed a few weeks later. Paris loves redemption stories, but it loves collapses even more. The band starts up again, and Josephine is pulled toward the dance floor. She moves with that same radiant energy as before, a kinetic miracle. The crowd adores her, feeding on her light. But when she spins too quickly and steadies herself against a chair, you realize how thin that light really is. Paris doesn't ask its icons to be happy just to keep shining. You stay until the club begins to empty. On the way out, you overhear a critic saying, "Baker is the antidote to our grief." You almost laugh. In this city, everything is an antidote until it becomes another ailment. You walk along the Champs-Élysées, the boulevard, slick with reflections of headlights. A man stumbles out of an alley, clutching his coat. He's humming a tune from Josephine's show, off-key but heartfelt. You watch him vanish into the rain, another ghost in a city that's full of them. Historians still debate whether Baker and Cocteau were products of their time or its saviors. Perhaps they were both two souls who turned suffering into spectacle, proving that beauty and pain aren't opposites, just partners in the same tired dance. You stop by a newspaper stand. The headlines shout about inflation, politics, the latest art scandal. No one mentions heroin, of course. The city prefers its vices, whispered, not printed. By the time you reach your room, dawn is already smudging the sky pink. You sit by the window, thinking of Josephine's radiant smile and Cocteau's trembling hands. The music still echoes faintly in your ears. It's a kind that refuses to fade, even after silence falls. You realize that in Paris, everyone performs on stage or off, some with feathers, some with words, some with syringes. The trick is simply to make it look effortless, and because the night always deserves a laugh. You recall the bartender's farewell as you left the club. Careful walking home. Our streets are paved with inspiration and bad decisions. You look down at the cobblestones, glittering in the early light, and think, he wasn't wrong. The sun climbs lazily over the rooftops, painting Paris gold, but you're heading where the light doesn't quite reach. The glamour, the applause, the cabarets, they all depend on a hidden network of hands and hustles. A quiet machinery that keeps the city's euphoric hum alive. Today, you're tracing the veins that carry heroin from distant fields to Parisian wrists, following a trail that smells of earth, smoke, and colonial profit. You start at the docks, where barges bob like sleeping beasts along the Seine. Crates are being unloaded coffee, silk, tobacco, and somewhere among them, the more secret cargo. The labels say medical supplies or pharmaceutical tinctures. Nobody looks too closely. The customs officer takes his time with his cigarette, not his paperwork. Here's your mainstream fact. Much of the raw opium that fueled Europe's heroin trade came from French Indochina modern day, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The colonial government oversaw opium production and taxation under what they called the Rigi DL opium. Officially, it was meant for medicinal use. Unofficially, it was a financial goldmine that fed both the empire and the growing appetite of cities like Paris. You picture it halfway across the world. In humid fields near Saigon, laborers slice poppy pods and collect the thick resin that seeps out, glistening like amber in the sun. It's shipped across oceans, transformed in labs, and reborn in Paris as something elegant, mysterious decadence in a vile dot. A man named Etienne guides you through the maze of the docks. He's thin, nervous, his hat pulled low. He calls himself a facilitator, which sounds far classier than smuggler. As you walk, he keeps glancing over his shoulder. You can move anything through this city, he says, as long as it's labeled properly and bribes are paid promptly. Etienne tells you about chemists in Lyon and Marseille who process the imported morphine into pure heroin. The product is then diluted, disguised, and distributed to pharmacies, private clubs, and anyone who knows which door to knock on. The city's addiction, like its art, is an open secret, visible only to those willing to see. You pause at a warehouse where the smell of chemicals stings your nose. Inside, a group of workers stack barrels stamped with the Bayer logo. You think of the Irony Bear, the same company that once marketed heroin as a cough remedy, safe and non-addictive. The slogan lingers like a ghost on every crate. Etienne laughs when he catches your expression. Medicine or poison, it's all about dosage and paperwork. He winks, then adds, and paperwork's easy to fix. Historians still argue whether the French government truly turned a blind eye to the domestic heroin trade or simply lost control of the empire's narcotic revenues. Some claim officials knew exactly how much money was being laundered through colonial opium taxes. Others insist corruption operated too low and too wide to trace. The truth, as usual, probably lies between the ledgers and the lies. You leave the docks and head toward the Marais district, where a small apothecary with a green cross gleams in the window. Inside, glass jars line the shelves lavender, camphor, quinine, and behind the counter, a locked cabinet containing restricted substances. The pharmacist, Madame Fournier, greets you with a smile, too polite to be honest. She's in her 50s, neat as a ruler, her gray hair pinned tightly. You're looking for something to sleep, she asks in a tone that already knows the answer. You tell her you're just curious about how medicine is changing in Paris. Her eyes soften, but only slightly. Everything changes, she says, unlocking the cabinet, some of it faster than it should. She shows you small glass ampules labeled diacetylmorphine hydrochloride. The print is crisp, professional, purest form, she says. Only available by prescription, of course. She closes the cabinet and leans closer. But you'd be amazed how creative people can be with their doctors. You ask if she's ever refused a sale. She smiles again, but this time it doesn't reach her eyes. Every refusal is an invitation to go elsewhere. My choice is to serve responsibly. Let the streets serve instead. A quirky tidbit surfaces as she talks. Parisian pharmacies during the 1920s sometimes offered heroin lozenges advertised as remedies for sore throats or menstrual pain. The labels bore elegant calligraphy, and the ads featured models in evening gowns. Imagine buying your next fix between cough drops and toothpaste. It was that ordinary. You thank Madame Fournier and step back into the street. The city feels different now, as if every elegant window hides a ledger of addiction. You can't unsee the pattern. Colonial supply, domestic demand, bureaucratic denial. The entire system hums like a jazz band, everyone playing their part. Nobody asking who wrote the tune. Etienne catches up with you again near Place de la Bastille, clutching a folded newspaper. Word is, a big shipment's due tonight, he says. Comes through Gare de Lyon, marked as surgical alcohol. You raise an eyebrow. That's risky, you say. He grins. Only if you get caught. And even then, you just blame the paperwork. You follow him into the station later that evening. The place is alive with movement porters shouting, trains hissing, the clatter of metal and motion. Etienne slips through the crowd with practiced ease. You feel the thrill of danger in your veins, even though you're just observing. When the shipment arrives, it looks mundane. Wooden crates, neatly sealed. The real exchange happens quickly, quietly. A man in a doctor's coat signs a form. The customs officer nods, and the crates vanish into a waiting van. It's so ordinary, you almost laugh. In Paris, even crime has good manners. Historians still argue whether Paris's interwar heroin scene was primarily criminal or bureaucratica, black market operation, or a state-enabled loophole. The lines were blurry then, as they often are now. Paper trails dissolve faster than powder in a spoon, as you and Etienne part ways. He offers you one last bit of unsolicited wisdom. You know why Paris runs on heroin, he says? Because it believes in beauty more than truth. And heroin, well, it's the most beautiful lie we ever sold ourselves. He tips his hat and vanishes into the night, leaving you with the faint smell of smoke and sea salt. You walk home slowly, your steps echoing against the cobblestones. The city's lights glitter across the river, reflections bending and warping with every ripple. Somewhere behind those lights are the hands that make it all possible: the farmers, chemists, smugglers, pharmacists, and dreamers. Paris's elegance, you realize, is always stitched together by someone else's shadow. And just when your thoughts turn to heavy, you pass a street vendor selling roasted chestnuts who calls out, "Want some, monsieur?" They're addictive. You laugh out loud, startling yourself. If only he knew how accurate that was. The city wakes under a thin veil of fog, and you feel it Paris, trying to look innocent again. But behind the perfume counters and polished shop fronts, the whispers have turned into murmurs, and the murmurs are growing louder. People are dying quietly. The newspapers are skirting the truth, and the officials oh. The officials are still pretending it's an artistic trend. Not an epidemic. You find yourself outside the Prefecture de Police on Ion de la Cite. The hulking gray building crouched beside the Seine, like a bureaucratic beast. Inside, men in stiff collars and sharper tempers shuffle papers and exchange glances that say, "We're aware, but not responsible." The public outcry hasn't quite reached fever pitch yet, but rumors of narcotic crimes have begun to unsettle even the city's most bohemian corners. Your mainstream fact comes early. By the mid-1920s, France passed its first real narcotics control laws, largely modeled after international pressure from the League of Nations. These laws attempted to regulate morphine, cocaine, and heroin, but the enforcement was laughably inconsistent. Pharmacies continued to sell diluted versions under prescription loopholes, while black market dealers flourished in alleys the police tended not to see. You're escorted down a hallway by a weary inspector named Dubois. His mustache twitches whenever he speaks, like it's trying to escape. It's not that we don't want to stop it, he tells you, rubbing his temples. It's that everyone who can afford a lawyer seems to have a prescription. He gestures toward a stack of confiscated ampules on his desk. We seized this on Monday. It's replaced by Wednesday. Paris is efficient, at least. He shows you his ledger. Arrests for improper medical distribution, fraudulent prescription, public intoxication. Most of the names are artists, journalists, students-people with too much imagination and too little inhibition. You notice a few recognizable surnames. Those, Dubois sighs. We file, then forget. Can't have the press writing that the poets are peddlers. Historians still argue whether early French policing of narcotics was sabotaged by corruption or simply indifference. Some scholars insist the system was too small to tackle a problem that big. Others believe bribes from pharmacies and colonial traders greased the entire process. Either way, the heroin kept flowing quietly, elegantly, legally enough to feel respectable. From the police station, you head to the Hotel Dieu hospital nearby. The air smells faintly of disinfectant and regret. You meet a young doctor, Claire Morel, who works in the nervous disorders ward, a euphemism for everything society doesn't want to name. She looks exhausted, her eyes red from sleepless shifts. Addiction isn't our department, she says bitterly. At least, not officially. They call it habit fatigue or nervous collapse. We patch them up and send them home. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't. She pauses, glancing toward a curtained bed. That one, he's a musician. Came in saying he swallowed stars. He meant heroin. You watch her, check his pulse. The man's fingers are yellowed, his veins faint bruises beneath the translucent skin. We're supposed to treat the symptoms, Claire says. But the symptoms are people. Her words hang heavy, truth too large for the sterile walls. She shows you a locked cabinet filled with vials and morphine syringes. We use this for pain management, she explains. Same stuff killing them on the streets. Isn't that something? She forces a small laugh that dies quickly. Medicine and poison, two faces of the same mask. A quirky tidbit emerges from her recollections. A group of Parisian doctors once debated whether heroin might actually prevent alcoholism by offering a cleaner form of intoxication. You blink, unsure if she's joking. She isn't. There was a conference paper, she says, shaking her head. Sometimes science dances as wildly as the cabaret. You leave the hospital feeling heavier, the Saints Miss now clinging to your clothes. Across the street, a journalist waits with a notebook. His name is Henry Barreau, a real firebrand with ink-stained fingers. You want to know why the police failed? He asks, lighting a cigarette. Because half the officers have cousins running pharmacies. He exhales a plume of smoke. Paris protects his illusions better than his citizens. You walk together toward the Boulevard Saint-Michel, where the cafes are already buzzing. Students sip espresso beside morphine addicts hiding behind sunglasses. Henry lowers his voice. We're working on a series, The Hidden Poison of Paris, but the editor's nervous. Too many advertisers sell wellness tonics. You glance around. He's right. Every street corner displays posters for miracle remedies, syrups, powders, elixirs. The typography is elegant. The lies, even more so. Historians still debate the effectiveness of the 1920s. Press in confronting addiction. Some say journalists helped spark reform. Others argue their stories glamorized it, turning the heroin habit into yet another symbol of modern rebellion. Maybe both were true. Truth and spectacle have always shared a bed in this city. Later that evening, you slip into a smoky salon near the Sorbonne. A small crowd listens to a lecture titled The Social Dangers of Artificial Euphoria. The speaker, a politician named Monsieur Legrand, gestures dramatically as he declares, "Our youth are being devoured by chemical devils." The audience claps politely, then orders more wine. You can't help but chuckle. Paris loves moral panic, as long as it comes with good acoustics. After the lecture, Legrand corners you, mistaking your silence for admiration. "We must criminalize the addicts," he insists. "Make an example of them." You ask if punishment will cure despair. He frowns, caught off guard. "Well," he says, "it might discourage imitation." You thank him and leave before he can quote himself again. Outside, the night feels alive with contradictions. You pass a police patrol, shooing away a beggar, while across the street, a pharmacist's window glows with neatly arranged bottles of morphine elixir. Enforcement, it seems, depends entirely on who can afford curtains. You duck into a cafe to escape the drizzle. The waiter pours you coffee and mutters, "Careful, monsieur, too much caffeine, and the police might classify you." You laugh. He doesn't. Maybe the city's humor is just running dry, as the bells of Notre Dame toll midnight. You think about all the people trapped between law and longing, the doctors prescribing comfort, the detectives pretending blindness, the artists caught in the crossfire. Paris is trying to regulate its dreams, and dreams do not like being regulated. Then, because the night demands at least one absurd moment, a cat jumps onto your table, knocks over your sugar bowl, and stares at you as if to say, "You think you can control anything here?" You sigh, push the sugar toward it, and whisper, "Fair point." The cat licks its paw, unimpressed, then hops off toward the street. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wails, and you can't tell whether it's chasing crime or tragedy. In Paris, the two often arrive hand in hand, politely late, impeccably dressed. You wake to church bells that sound like they're apologizing for last night. The air is cold, and Paris feels hung over not from wine, but from its own excess. You walk through the narrow lanes of the Latin Quarter, where a quiet revolution is brewing, not the political kind, but something more intimate. People are trying to heal, to pull themselves out of the fog without divine help, without judgment, without even the vocabulary for what they're feeling. This is the city's first whisper of recovery. Long before anyone dares call it that, your footsteps lead you to a shabby cafe on Rue des Écoles. Its windows are fogged, and the chalkboard out front simply reads, "Café Chat, pas de sermons." Inside, a handful of people sit around a long table, sipping coffee and avoiding each other's eyes. The owner, a woman named Odette, wipes the counter with a rag that's seen better decades. She glances at you, then nods toward the group. "They're my regulars," she says softly. "They don't drink. They talk." At first, it looks like just another morning coffee club. Then you listen closer. They're sharing stories, haltingly, ashamedly, but stories nonetheless. One man speaks about the shakes that hit him every evening around 7. How he distracts himself by counting the tiles in his kitchen. A woman admits she hides from her dealer by taking the long route home past 3 churches. As if divine surveillance might work better than willpower. There's no priest here, no doctor, no authority. Just ordinary people trying to stay afloat in a city that romanticizes drowning. Here's your mainstream fact for alcoholics. Okay, Anonymous wouldn't be founded until 1935 in America. Informal mutual aid gatherings existed in Paris as early as the 1920s. Some formed around churches, others around cafes like this one, where addiction was quietly treated as an illness rather than a sin or a crime. These early groups laid the groundwork for the compassionate treatment model that would take another half-century to formalize. The man leading today's conversation, Jean-Paul, a former pharmacist, clears his throat. We call it La Ligue, do silence, he says, because if people knew, they'd laugh. He smiles faintly, but silence has its uses. You can hear your heartbeat in it. You watch as they pass around a notebook, each writing something before sliding it along. When it reaches you, you see the first line, "I survived another morning." You add nothing, just underline it once, softly, as if to agree. John Paul tells you he used to measure his days by dosage, not hours. Now I'm measured by breaths, he says. Some days I'm still short. He laughs at his own joke, then winces. Sorry, habit. Historians still argue whether these proto-recovery circles were genuinely effective, or simply a temporary reprieve for the desperate. Some records suggest relapse rates were high. Others hint that a few managed long-term sobriety. But one thing's certain, they humanized the addict in a time when even doctors hesitated to touch them. When the meeting ends, you linger as chairs scrape and coffee cups clink. Odette approaches with a refill. They come every Tuesday, she says. I charge half price. Figure it's cheaper than confession. She chuckles, then glances toward the group filing out. They're brave, trying to live clean in a dirty city. You step outside and follow the flow of pedestrians. The sky is a dull pewter, and the street smells faintly of roasted chestnuts and rain-soaked stone. You pass a bookshop with a new display. Modern Psychology, the mind's hidden mechanisms. Inside, a young student argues with the clerk about Freud's latest theories. Addiction isn't sin, he insists. It's displacement. The clerk shrugs. Displacement or not, the morphine's still missing from my cabinet. You stifle a laugh. Parisian debate always ends in inventory problems. You continue toward a clinic near the Gare du Nord, where Dr. René Coutens has begun experimenting with a new approach. He treats addicts not as criminals, but as patients with nervous maladies. His office smells of iodine and hope. We use small doses to taper withdrawal, he explains, adjusting his spectacles. Cold turkey kills more than the drug itself, okay? Sighs. But try telling that to Parliament. Ha. He pulls out a folder of patient notes, yellowed at the edges. Some recover. Most vanish. But at least someone tried. You ask him why he persists. Because I once believed heroin made people honest, he says. It strips away masks. Now, acid just replaces them. Quirky tidbit during this era. Some French clinics prescribed mild electric therapy to reset the nervous system of addicts. Patients described it as like being tickled by lightning. The idea didn't last long, thankfully, but it's one of those well-intentioned absurdities Paris excels at. Leaving the clinic, you wander to the Luxembourg Gardens. Families stroll beneath orange leaves. Children sail toy boats across the fountain. It looks peaceful, even wholesome until you notice a young woman sitting alone on a bench, clutching a letter. Her fingers twitch. She looks up and meets your gaze. You know a place where they help people? She asks. You nod toward Rue des Ecoles. She exhales shakily. Good, because I'm running out of Tuesdays. You walk away slowly, the image of her trembling hands etched into your mind. The city's healing, you realize, isn't happening in hospitals or parliaments. It's happening in whispers, in back rooms, in the courage to stay another day. That night, you return to Odette's cafe. The lights are low, the chairs stacked. She's sweeping the floor, humming something half forgotten. We'll keep at it, she says, not looking up. The trick is showing up sober enough to try again. Outside, the wind picks up, scattering old flyers advertising miracle tonics and restorative elixirs. You catch one midair. The slogan reads, "Freedom in a bottle." You tear it gently. Let the pieces drift into the gutter and whisper, maybe freedom's just coffee and company. As you head home, a man in a bowler hat bumps into you, mutters an apology, and disappears into the dark. You glance down to see what he dropped, a small glass vial, empty. The city never runs out of ghosts, only new disguises for them. And, because Paris insists on comedic timing, even in melancholy, a newspaper vendor shouts behind you, "New edition." Doctors blame jazz for moral decline. You can't help laughing. The man frowns, uncertain if you're mocking him or the headline. "Maybe both," you say, and keep walking. You cross the bridge over the Seine, watching your reflection ripple below. The water moves slow and sure, carrying everything it's given: sins, secrets, syringes, stories. And above it all, the bells toll again. This time, they sound less like an apology and more like a reminder. Survival has its own kind of music. The next morning, Paris feels softer, almost tender, as if it, too, has a hangover it's trying to disguise with perfume. You wander toward the right bank, where the smell of baking bread mixes with car exhaust in yesterday's rain. It's easy to mistake this city for something delicate, but beneath the lace and laughter, you can feel it, the quiet rebellion of women learning to wield their freedom. Like a razor, you're heading toward the salons of Saint-Germain, des Prés, where conversation sparkles and subversion wears silk. The heroin craze hasn't skipped these rooms. Sit, just learned better manners. Behind the chatter about art and politics, there's the clink of glass ampoules, the subtle pass of a silver case beneath a shawl. This is where addiction becomes aesthetic, and dependency becomes a kind of defiance. You slip into a salon hosted by Marguerite, famed poet, fashion plate, and, if rumor holds true, occasional muse to half the city's artists. Her apartment glows with lamplight reflected in gilt mirrors. Cigarette smoke curls toward the ceiling like ghostly handwriting. Marguerite greets you with a kiss on each cheek, her lipstick perfectly smudged in that way only Parisians can pull off. "You're just in time," she purrs. We were about to start discussing despair. Round her, women lounge on velvet sofas, painters, dancers, wives of men they've outgrown. The men hover at the edges, pretending to listen. On the table, silver tray holds champagne flutes and a few small glass vials labeled Heroin Craze. The branding looks as polished as jewelry. Here's your mainstream fact. In 1920s Paris, women were not only using heroin, they were redefining what it meant to be seen using it. For many, the drug symbolized modern freedom, a rebellion against Victorian restraint. Morphine and heroin were prescribed for nervous conditions, menstrual pain, and insomnia, giving women both medical legitimacy and social camouflage. Marguerite pours you a drink and gestures toward a dancer named Simone. She's explaining how heroin makes silence sparkle, as if the drug itself is an accessory. "Men write their sorrow," Simone says. "We wear ours." The room hums with laughter and agreement. You notice how carefully everyone performs their indifference, how they treat danger as a perfume rather than poison. One woman twirls her pearl necklace as she muses. "We're allowed to faint in public, but not to feel too much. So we make fainting fashionable." You can't help smiling. Parisian feminism, it seems, comes with a side of irony. Historians still argue whether female heroin users of the era were victims of medical exploitation or pioneers of bodily autonomy. Some say they were seduced by a patriarchal pharmaceutical culture. Others insist they were seizing control in the only way available, by medicating their discontent on their own terms. As usual, the truth wears both faces. Later, the conversation shifts. A young journalist named Helene, short hair, sharp tongue, reads from her essay draft. "If heroin grants men transcendence, why does it grant women scandal?" The room falls quiet. Then Marguerite claps her hands. "Write that down," she declares. "We'll make it a manifesto." The group erupts into laughter, but beneath it, you sense something fierce, fermenting hunger to be more than muses, more than cautionary tales. Even through their haze of elegance and morphine, they see the double standard clearly. You step onto the balcony for air. Below, the Seine glints under the afternoon sun. Two women walk arm in arm. their bobbed hair swaying like defiance in motion. You think of the posters in pharmacies advertising relief for ladies' nerves. Now those same bottles are now hidden in handbags beside lipstick and cigarettes. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. One popular 1920s advertisement for a heroin-based cough syrup promised that it would make women serene, sociable, and sleep well enough to charm. The slogan could have doubled as social advice. The ad even showed a smiling woman beside a cradle, because nothing sells better than the illusion of control. You return inside to find the mood changed. The gramophone plays a slow jazz record, and the women move like smoke dancing, half joking, half mourning, something unnamed. Simone leans against the piano, whispering to you, "Do you know what freedom feels like?" It's the moment before the dose. Her eyes glisten, not from tears, but from exhaustion in the corner. Marguerite's husband enters, an older man with a banker's stiffness. He takes in the scene, frowns, and mutters. Again, Marguerite smiles sweetly. Always, when he leaves, she exhales deeply. He prefers his opium in the stock exchange. Historians still debate whether heroin truly empowered women or simply trapped them in a more luxurious cage. Some accounts describe female addicts as tragic figures. Others paint them as avant-garde saints of suffering. Paris adored both versions so long as they photographed well. As the night deepens, Marguerite invites you to stay for dinner. The conversation meanders from Proust to politics to perfume. The heroin tray is replaced with a bowl of fruit, as if the transformation from indulgence to civility can happen with a single swap. "Moderation," she says, cutting a pear. "That's how we survive men and medicine." You laugh, and she smiles knowingly. "Careful," she says. "If you laugh too loudly, they'll call it hysteria." When the evening ends, you step into the cool air again. The city feels different after such a gathering, more honest, more dangerous. The lamplight seems to pulse in time with the beat of the salons. Laughter, rebellion, denial. You walk past a newsstand displaying a new magazine, Cover La Parisienne, modern, featuring a woman smoking. Her gaze, direct and daring. Beneath her image, she dares. Therefore, she is dot. You think of the women you met tonight in her own way, each balancing freedom and fragility like champagne glasses on trembling fingers. Paris applauds their beauty, but fears their autonomy. As you cross the street, a man tips his hat and mutters, "Modern women, no mystery left." You can't help replying. You're just looking in the wrong places. And then, because Paris never resists a theatrical ending, rain begins to fall, gentle, rhythmic, almost staged. You pull your coat tighter and imagine the salons closing one by one. Women wiping off their lipstick, hiding their vials, and writing verses by candlelight. They're not chasing oblivion anymore. They're chasing authorship. Still, you can't shake Simone's words. Freedom is the moment before the dose. In this city of masks, maybe that's the truest definition of liberation anyone can manage. Morning sunlight breaks through a gauzy curtain of mist as you step into the port district. The Seine widens and ships groan like restless animals. The smell is thick salt oil and something faintly sweet. You realize, after a moment, that it's opium. Not the perfume kind, but the raw scent of the poppy's ghost, clinging to burlap sacks stamped Saigon, Haiphong, Tonkin. You're not in the salons anymore. This is where the city's pretty poison begins its journey. You walk along the quay as workers unload crates from a freighter. A foreman barks orders in a mix of French and Vietnamese, and nobody looks surprised by the language blend. Paris, for all its sophistication, is built on what its colonies provide in right now. The most profitable thing Indochina can offer isn't rice or rubber, but poppies. Here's your mainstream fact. During the 1920s, much of the heroin circulating in France originated from morphine manufactured with opium imported from French Indochina. The colonial government maintained monopolies on opium production and sale, funding infrastructure and military operations through its profits. Officially, the drug trade was regulated. Unofficially, it leaked like a sieve. You follow a man named Duck, a dock worker who moonlights as an interpreter for customs officials. He gestures toward a stack of crates marked as medical supplies. They check half, he says with a shrug. Guess which half? He laughs softly, not cruelly, but wearily. It's all a circle, monsieur. You take our poppies, we get your pain. The remark hits harder than the morning chill. You realize that Heroin's Parisian story isn't just about poets and party sits, about empire, about how suffering is repackaged, shipped, and soul. Lights a cigarette. You notice his hands trembling slightly. You ask? He shakes his head. No, my brother. Back home. The French doctors gave it to him after the war. Said it would help him forget. It worked too well. He flicks the match into the river. Now he forgets everything. Historians still argue whether France's colonial opium system was primarily economic or strategic, whether it was a moral failure, calculated exploitation, or both. Some defend it as a necessary financial tool for empire. Others call it state-sponsored addiction. Either way, the smoke from those fields in Indochina eventually drifts right here into Parisian lungs. You board a tram heading toward the 10th arrondissement, where the air is cleaner, but the conscience isn't. Factories hum with precision, converting morphine into heroin with sterile efficiency. You imagine the process: white powder crystallizing in glass, packed into tiny bottles labeled purity and relief. The language of commerce disguising the reality of conquest. A quirky tidbit for you. At one point, the French colonial administration actually ran opium dens in Indochina as government franchises. Patrons could buy state-approved opium, smoke it in comfortable surroundings, and even earn loyalty discounts. The profits funded public works, back home bridges, schools, railroads, civilization, quite literally. Built on smoke, the tram stops near a cafe frequented by colonial veterans men who served in Saigon or Hanoi. Their memories heavy with humidity and regret. Inside, the walls are covered with sepia photographs of tropical landscapes and stern men in pith helmets. One patron waves you over. You look like you've seen ghosts, he says. You reply, only the ones that ship by crate. He grins. Then you've seen them all. He tells you about the poppy fields, how they stretched like blood-colored oceans under the sun. Beautiful, he says, until you know what it's for. He remembers soldiers smoking to dull the boredom and pain. We didn't call it addiction, he says. We called it patience. As the afternoon wanes, you wander through the streets of Chinatown, where immigrants from the colonies have gathered in small enclaves. In a dim back room, you find a group playing mahjong. The air smells of incense and faint opium residue. One old man looks up and smiles. You from Paris? He asks in French. You are Paris, you answer. He laughs softly. No, Paris is upstairs. We are the basement. His hands move gracefully over the tiles, clacking like punctuation marks. But every house needs a foundation. The irony settles on you like dust. These men built the city's economy from the underbelly of its empire, yet their faces rarely appear in its stories. The heroin that fuels Paris's glitter comes from fields their families tend, shipped through ports their labor maintains. And when addiction strikes them, there are no Marguerites hosting salons for sympathy. Outside, a poster on a wall declares, France civilized Le Monde. France civilizes the world. You can't help whispering, and the world returns the favor. Historians still debate how deeply heroin use affected colonial soldiers and laborers. Some evidence suggests widespread dependency among Indo-Chinese workers conscripted into the French army and public works. Others argue the scale has been exaggerated by later critics. But what's undeniable is the human trail between empire and euphoria. Paris may dream in gold, but it bleeds in red poppies. As dusk falls, You make your way back to the river. The freighter from Hapong is gone, its berth empty. You imagine its cargo scattered through the city, a gram for a poet, a bottle for a pharmacist, a fortune for a politician. Above it all, Notre Dame's bells toll, oblivious to where their funding once came from. A gust of wind stirs the water, carrying a faint, bitter scent from the docks. You close your eyes and think of Duke's brother, forgetting, forgiving, fading somewhere half a world away. You wonder how many lives were built, was between lost between those 2 points on a map, as the sky darkens to a shade of ink. You walk along the Seine's edge, the lamps flickering like veins of light through the city's body. You picture Paris as one enormous organism's heart beating in Montmartre, its lungs at the port, its bloodstream laced with heroin drawn from the colonies. Every hit, every high, every whispered sigh connects the empire to the metropole in a loop that never quite breaks. And because even the heaviest truths come with Parisian irony, you pass a billboard for a new colonial exhibition, The Gifts of Empire, a celebration of progress. Below the title, an artist rendering shows a Vietnamese farmer handing poppies to a smiling French nurse. You almost laugh, almost, but the laughter dies somewhere behind your ribs. You keep walking until the sound of the river drowns everything else, until all you can hear is the steady pulse of the current, relentless, indifferent, ancient. It reminds you of what Duck said. You take our poppies, we get your pain. Maybe that's the truest symmetry of empire suffering, traded, not shared. You wake to the hiss of a steam iron and the rustle of silk. The city hums with preparation Paris, dressing itself for another day of spectacle. You're in the Marais now, where ateliers bloom like hothouses of obsession. Here, the heroin craze slips into something tailored, stitched, scented, and sold as elegance. The scent of dye, starch, and perfume hangs heavy in the air as you pass open windows where dressmakers work by lamplight. A mannequin stands half-draped in ivory satin, its head tilted as if listening to secrets. And secrets are the currency here because behind the polished image of 1920s haute couture, something darker threads through the seams. Inside one of these ateliers, you find yourself amid a storm of fabric and chatter. Needles flash like lightning. The young designer named Emile, all cheekbones and caffeine, waves you in. Watch your step, he says. We're sowing delirium. You glance at the table. There is champagne in teacups, powder on mirrors, laughter too loud for the hour. Inspiration, he explains, grinning. Here's your mainstream fact. The fashion world of 1920s Paris often intersected with the city's nightlife and narcotic subculture. Designers, models, and artists shared the same smoky cabarets and after-hours dens. Coco Chanel herself was linked to morphine use, and many contemporaries blurred the line between creative stimulation and chemical dependency. Heroin became a whispered musa, dangerous luxury. Emile leads you to a rack of shimmering dresses. You see this stitching, he says. Every bead sewn by someone too tired to blink. Every hem a confession. He leans closer. The girls keep going with a little help. You know the white help. You glance toward a seamstress in the corner, her eyes glassy, her movements mechanical but precise. She hums softly, perhaps to keep time, perhaps to stay awake. It's not glamour, Emile mutters, almost to himself. It's survival in silk. Historians still argue whether fashion's obsession with decadence during the 1920s was escapism from post-war trauma or a subconscious echo of it. Paris dressed itself in sequins, the way a soldier might polish his boots rituals to hide the ruin underneath. A model bursts into the room, laughing too loudly. Emile, they adored the new collection, less poppies. Genius. You realize the title is a pun on poppies and dolls. The irony isn't lost on you. The dresses, flowing red, deep crimson, gold look, almost like fields in bloom. You touch the fabric. It's warm from the heat of the irons. The color of temptation, Emile says, with a wink. You ask him where he gets his ideas. He taps his temple, dreams. And dreams don't come cheap. He gestures to a small vial on his desk, just enough to make the world sharper. Yes, fashion needs vision. Vision needs courage. Courage needs, he pauses, shrugs. Well, you see the pattern? In a corner, a journalist sketches notes for a feature on the modern Parisienne. Her pencil scratches like a heartbeat. We write about heroin as a scandal, she says, not looking up. But we photograph it as style. That's your quirky tidbit. In 1920s fashion photography, the gaunt, faraway heroin chic aesthetic appeared long before the term existed. Models with hollow eyes and languid poses became symbols of sophistication. No one said addict. They said ethereal. Ethereal. The look sold perfume, jewelry, and couture by the ARMFUL as evening descends. You follow Emile to a runway show at a hotel near Place Vendôme. The lobby shimmers with chandeliers, and the crowd glitters with the arrogance of people who think art and excess are the same thing. You slide into a seat beside a woman in an emerald gown. They say, the collection's inspired by dreams, she whispers. Or nightmares, depending on how much you've taken. The lights dim. Music swells us, slow jazz, rhythm, thick and smoky. One by one, models glide down the runway, their gowns catching light like liquid. But it's their expressions that captivate you calm, detached, untouchable. Each face looks like it belongs to someone who has already left the room in that moment. Fashion and addiction merge seamlessly. The crowd gasps, not at the clothes, but at the illusion, the perfect stillness. The suggestion of suffering beneath glamour. Beauty, Paris decides, is best served tragic. After the show, champagne flows freely. You overhear one critic murmur, so modern, so fragile. Another replies, so marketable. The applause fades into the clink of glasses. You find Emile leaning against a marble column, smoking. His eyes are rimmed with red, but he's smiling. Did they love it? You ask. He exhales. They loved the sadness, he says. They always do. Historians still debate whether the fashion world's flirtation with drug culture was deliberate marketing or a symptom of creative burnout. Some argue that designers and artists mirrored the instability of the age. Others claim they exploited it. Either way, the city made addiction look exquisite. Later, you followed the after-party to a rooftop terrace. Paris sprawls below, glowing like a jeweled serpent. The champagne bubbles, the laughter rises, and the line between celebration and despair blurs like a brushstroke in moonlight. Young model named Therese sits on the ledge, legs crossed, eyes unfocused. I feel lighter up here, she says, like I could float away. Said, you ask if she's all right? She nods slowly. I'm fine. Just fine. Looks better from a distance. You can't help but think how perfectly Paris sells distance between beauty and pain, between the catwalk and the gutter. Somewhere below, a tram rumbles past, filled with seamstresses heading home, their fingers raw, their pay barely enough for bread or escape. The wind picks up, carrying the faint scent of perfume and morphine from the streets below. You close your eyes. For a moment, you can almost hear the poppies whispering through fabric, through lungs, through history. You look down at your reflection in a champagne glass. The bubbles rise, burst, and vanish like inspiration, like memory, like every illusion the city sells under gaslight. And you can't shake the feeling that Paris itself is modeling something tonight. Not a dress, but a warning disguised as desire. Because here, beauty isn't just worn, it's consumed. The streets smell different now, not of pastries or perfume, but of rain and disinfectant. It's late autumn, 1928, and Paris has begun to sober up, at least on paper. You can feel it in the quieter cafes, in the way jazz has softened from frenzy to melancholy. and how the laughter that once spilled from every Montmartre window now sounds rehearsed. The party isn't over yet, but everyone knows the hangover has started. You walk along Boulevard de Clichy, past shuttered cabarets where posters curl and peel. The bright colors fade like memories left in sunlight. You remember when these same corners vibrated with the pulse of the Charleston, when laughter echoed through smoke. Now, the laughter is thinner, like a cough hiding behind lipstick. In a small alley, you hear the faint clatter of glass. A man kneels by the wall, empty vials glittering around him like spilled jewels. He looks up, eyes hollow, and mutters, "They cut it now. Too much chalk. Not enough dream." Then he laughs it dry. Rasping sounding disappears into the night. Here's your mainstream fact. By the late 1920s, France had begun tightening regulations on narcotics, following international pressure from the League of Nations. Heroin production was restricted, and pharmacies faced new scrutiny. Yet, the black market grew bolder, pushing cheaper, adulterated products that led to a surge in overdoses and hospitalizations. Police patrols now linger in places they once ignored. The city that turned addiction into poetry is learning how to criminalize it. You see a notice posted outside a police station: possession and trafficking of heroin punishable by imprisonment. The font looks self-satisfied, as if morality finally got its paperwork in order. But not everyone buys the redemption story. In a cafe near Pigalle, a writer named Alain stirs his coffee like it's the last ritual left to him. "You can't arrest a craving," he says, his voice flat. "You can only make it more expensive." He slides a scrap of paper toward your poem, scrawled in shaky ink. The first line reads, "The city exhales, and we disappear in the smoke." He smiles weakly. "Publish it if I don't wake up." Historians still argue whether the crackdown was driven by genuine concern or moral panic. Some say it was about protecting public health. Others insist it was about preserving France's reputation as a beacon of civilization. Either way, reform came too late for most who'd already vanished into the glitter. You step back onto the boulevard, where a police wagon rumbles past. Inside, two young men stare blankly through the bars. They could be poets or painters or just unlucky. Their faces blur in the rain. For a second, you think you recognize one from the cabaret last month, the one who played trumpet like his soul was on fire. Maybe he still does. You duck into a bookstore to escape the drizzle. The clerk, a thin woman with tired eyes, dusts off a new psychology text. "Addiction as a social disease," she reads aloud. Next, they'll diagnose heartbreak. You buy a copy anyway. The pages smell of damp paper and quiet revolution. A quirky tidbit. Some Parisian newspapers began running serialized confessionals, supposedly written by reformed addicts, though most were ghostwritten by journalists. Titles like "From Powder to Prayer" and "The Woman Who Slept with Her Syringe" sold briskly. Readers devoured the scandals with moral outrage, conveniently prepackaged for breakfast. Outside, the rain intensifies, drumming on the awnings. You pass a bakery, still open, warm light spilling onto the street. Inside, two nuns buy bread for their hospital ward. One murmurs. They come in, shaking. They leave quiet. The other nods. Sometimes they leave too quiet. You keep walking until the lights thin out and the Seine reappears, swollen and gray. The river looks tired too, carrying the city's sins downstream without judgment. Across the water, you spot a figure on the bridge, a woman, her coat too thin, her movements unsteady. You hurry closer, and she turns. It's Simone, the dancer from Marguerite's salon. She smiles faintly, rain streaking her mascara. "You remember me," she says. You nod. "You still dancing?" You ask. She shakes her head. "Not on stage." She holds out her hands, trembling. "Can't keep rhythm anymore, but I still hear the music." You walk her to a nearby shelter run by volunteers. Inside, the walls smell of bleach and hope. A young nurse takes her gently by the arm. We'll get you warm, she says. Simone looks back at you once, her eyes clearer than you remember. Tell Marguerite, she whispers. Freedom isn't the moment before, it's the moment after you stop. You stand there for a while, watching the nurse lead her away. Then you step outside again, the rain colder now, sharper. The city blurs into reflections, street lamps bending in puddles, neon bleeding into cobblestones. Paris looks beautiful in its decay, like a painting that refuses to dry. Historians still debate whether the end of the heroin craze marked progress or loss. Some celebrate the crackdown as moral renewal. Others mourn the extinguishing of a strange, creative fire. Art critics note how literature and music from the early 1930s lost some of their wild edges, became more structured, more careful. It's as if the city traded chaos for control, ecstasy for endurance. You wander back toward Montmartre. The cabarets that remain are smaller now, tamer. Jazz bands play softly. Audiences clap politely. Even the abstinent seems weaker. You sit at a corner table where once the air buzzed with danger and delight. Now it just hums with nostalgia. A waiter sets down your drink and shrugs. People still chase something, he says, just not as fast. He gestures toward the street where a poster announces a new law restricting nightlife hours. Soon, even joy will need a permit. You sip, and the taste feels diluted, like everything else. Still, there's comfort in the routine, the clink of the glass, the murmur of conversation, the faint jazz drifting from the radio. Paris hasn't lost its pulse. It's just quieter now, resting after the fever. You glance at the window. Outside, a young couple dances beneath an umbrella, their laughter breaking through the drizzle. You smile. The city's trying, in its own way, to forgive itself. And as you leave the cafe, you think about all the ghosts you've met, artists, addicts, dreamers each, one stitched into the city's memory like a thread of silk and sorrow. The heroine may be fading, but the craving for beauty, for oblivion, for something beyond the ordinary still runs through every heartbeat of Paris, because this city doesn't really recover. It just changes costumes. The year edges toward 1930, and Paris wakes up as if from a fever dream, sweating, shaky, pretending to remember less than it does. You walk through a city that's learning the vocabulary of regret. The headlines speak of reform, control, and moral hygiene. Pharmacies have replaced their glittering displays of miracle tonics with bland glass bottles labeled solution disinfectant. The same counters that once sold heroin over the counter now sell guilt by prescription. You pass a group of policemen outside a cafe. Their collars turned up, their conversation hushed. They're not chasing poets anymore. They're chasing chemists, smugglers, and ghosts. The government has declared victory. But the victory smells faintly of denial and floor polish. Here's your mainstream fact. In 1930, France passed the Loi sur les stupéfiants, aligning its narcotics policies with new international conventions. Heroin and morphine were reclassified as strictly medical substances, and unauthorized possession became a serious crime. Pharmacies were required to keep detailed registries. Prescriptions could now be audited. The state had entered the veins of its citizens with a rubber-stamped conscience. You stop at a police archive, where an officer shows you confiscated evidence, crystal vials, bent spoons, elegant cases engraved with initials. Artists, he says, shaking his head, always think they're immune to law. He pauses, then adds quietly, they're not immune to the rest either. In another folder lies a list of those arrested cafe owners, dancers, porters, doctors, and one name you recognize, John Paul, the pharmacist who led the little recovery circle on Rue des Écoles. Illegal distribution, the report says. You remember his soft-spoken manner, his insistence on compassion over condemnation. You imagine him behind bars, whispering encouragement to his cellmates, one breath at a time. Historians still argue whether France's narcotics reform saved lives or merely hid the problem beneath the paperwork. Some claim the new system reduced addiction rates. Others point to the thriving underground trade that replaced the legal one. Reform, like heroin, often works better in theory. You leave the archives and walk south toward St. Michel. The city's pulse feels slower now, its nights shorter, its laughter dimmer. A cafe pianist plays softly, half-heartedly, as a handful of patrons murmur over tepid drinks. You think back to the cabarets, the fevered art, the reckless laughter, all of it traded for curfews and caution. But not everyone has given up. In a converted attic near Montparnasse, a small group meets to discuss scientific rehabilitation. Doctors, philosophers, even a few exotics sit in a circle, surrounded by papers and cigarette smoke. A woman in spectacles, Dr. Elodie Morels, speaks with quiet conviction. Addiction is not moral failure, she says. It is a conversation between body and pain. She glances at you. We cannot cure people by punishing them. You nod, remembering Odette's cafe and the way she said, it's cheaper than confession. Maybe compassion is still hiding in the cracks of the system, waiting for its moment. A young man stands to read from his notes. We must build clinics, he declares, places where treatment replaces judgment. The others applaud, softly but sincerely. You can almost feel the shift of fragile hope, tentative as a new sobriety. And then, because Paris never lets hope exist without irony, the window rattles as a police siren passes below. Everyone falls silent. The young man lowers his notes. Dr. Morel exhales. We'll get there, she says, when the sirens stop meaning fear. You walk home under a sky, the color of faded pewter. Streetlights flicker through fog. Posters from a recent health campaign cling to lampposts. Protect the nation say, no to narcotics. The imagery is patriotic, the message paternal. You can't help smiling bitterly. Paris, once addicted to rebellion, is now addicted to righteousness. A quirky tidbit in 1931. A popular theatrical review included a comedic sketch called Monsieur Morphine. Character, dressed in a doctor's coat and devil horns, tempted Parisians with vials labeled inspiration, romance, and sleep. The audience laughed, but the laughter carried an unease as if mocking their own ghosts. The play closed after a few weeks, banned for bad moral influence. You stop at the Seine, watching reflections of government buildings shimmer across the water. They look clean, precise, too precise. You think about all the lives scrubbed out of the official narrative, all the names missing from the archives. Reform, it seems, has perfect penmanship, but a selective memory. Across the river, Notre-Dame looms its towers, catching the mist like a sigh. You imagine the city's new moralists kneeling inside, praying for purity, unaware that the walls themselves have absorbed decades of jazz, perfume, and whispered sins. Historians still debate, for the decline of Paris's drug culture signaled the end of its creative golden age. Some say sobriety dulled the edges of genius. Others insist the city simply matured. Maybe both are true. Every era pays for its own illusions. You continue walking until you reach an old storefront. The sign above it faded, but legend breeds apothecary moderne. Inside, the shelves are empty except for dust and echoes. You remember how they once gleamed with promises, relief, energy, clarity, courage. You run your fingers along the counter. The wood is scarred, smooth from years of transactions, hope traded for coins. A man enters, elderly, his coat threadbare. You looking for medicine? He asks. You shake your head. Just history. He chuckles softly. Same thing, isn't it? He tells you he used to work here, back when heroin was as common as aspirin. He smiles wistfully. People came in smiling, left floating. Then his eyes darkened until they stopped coming back. He picks up a bottle of aspirin from the shelf. Progress, he says. We traded one illusion for another. Outside, dusk falls. The lamps flicker on, bathing the city in gold. You think of everyone you've met, the dreamers, the healers, the fallen air, how each carried a piece of Paris inside them. The heroin may have been banned, but the hunger that fed it still lingers, the need to feel extraordinary. Even just for a moment, you reach the Pont Neuf, the oldest bridge in the city, and pause at the center. Below, the water glows with the reflection of streetlights, flowing endlessly, cleansing nothing. You whisper to yourself, maybe redemption isn't a cure. Maybe it's just staying awake. As the night deepens, you sense Paris exhaling again, not in despair, but in something quieter, steadier. The hysteria is gone. What remains is the rhythm of survival. The heroin craze has ended, but its shadow stretches long, etched into every heartbeat of the city that once mistook oblivion for art. You lean against the railing, listening to the murmur of the river. It sounds almost like a plausoft, fading, forgiving. Morning fog slides across the Seine like a breath held too long. You stand at the edge of the decade, watching Paris reshape itself again, still shimmering, still restless, but now wrapped in the armor of respectability. The headlines celebrate recovery, new regulations, modern medicine. Yet beneath the headlines, the city hums with the same old pulse, curiosity, longing, hunger for sensation. You can clean the streets, not the imagination. Here's your mainstream fact. By the early 1930s, France had effectively shut down domestic heroin production, and the legal market for opiates collapsed. Addiction rates fell, at least on paper, as the drug moved underground or shifted overseas. But even as Paris moved on, the global trade persisted, morphing, adapting, resurfacing in other cities. Other decades. You walk through the Latin Quarter, where university students argue about philosophy over weak coffee, their energy replacing the decadence that once filled these cafes. One boy quotes Freud, another quotes Marx, and a girl with ink-stained fingers murmurs about surrealism. The conversation is sharp, urgent. Paris is healing, not by forgetting, but by thinking, by dissecting its own illusions. Historians still argue whether this intellectual revival was born from sobriety or from loss. Did clarity replace chaos, or did caution replace courage? No one agrees, and maybe that's the point. Every age believes it's more enlightened than the last, until its own vices start to look poetic in hindsight. You pass a shop window displaying gramophones and sheet music. The record spinning inside hums faintly a jazz tune, slow and haunting. You recognize the melody, one of the songs that once filled the cabarets before the raids, before the silence. The label reads, "The Ghosts of Montmartre." You smile at the title. Paris has always known how to name its wounds beautifully. The shopkeeper catches your glance. "Still sells," he says. "People like to remember what almost killed them." Teased, you nod. "It's human nature," you reply. "We make nostalgia out of everything, even danger." Quirky tidbit: in 1932, a small avant-garde theater staged a play called The White Sleep, inspired by the city's heroin years. The lead actress fainted during rehearsal, not from drugs, but from exhaustion. Newspapers dubbed it fitting method acting. The show ran only 2 nights before being shut down by authorities. Too soon, they said. To honest you, keep walking until you find yourself back in Montmartre. The hill feels different, now less chaotic, more introspective. Painters still work on corners, but the colors have softened. You stop by a cafe that survived everything: wars, epidemics, scandals, raids. Marguerite's Cafe, the door creaks the same way it did years ago. Inside, the air smells of roasted coffee and something faintly sweet. Marguerite sits behind the counter, older now but unmistakable, her silver hair tied with a black ribbon. When she sees you, she smiles. Still wandering, she asks. You grin. Still listening, she laughs softly. The music never stops, you know. It just changes tempo. She pours you a cup. We used to dance faster. Now we sway. You sit slowly. The coffee is strong, grounding. On the wall behind her hangs a faded photographs, Moanne, Odette, and a few others you recognize. We were so sure we were immortal, Marguerite says, her gaze distant. Turns out we were just early. You both laugh quietly at that dot outside. The morning brightens. Children chase pigeons across the cobblestones. A street violinist plays something gentle, almost lullaby-like. Life has come back not in grand gestures, but in small, steady ones. Historians still debate whether the heroin craze of 1920s Paris should be remembered as tragedy or transformation. Some frame it as a moral collapse, others as a necessary experiment in freedom and pain. Perhaps it was both. A civilization testing its limits, discovering how close beauty and destruction can live together without collapsing entirely. You stand to leave. Marguerite catches your hand. Don't judge us too harshly, she says. Every generation thinks it's found a shortcut to meaning. Ours just came in a vial. You nod. And yours turned it into art, you say. She smiles faintly. In regret, you step back into the sunlight. The air feels cleaner, but not empty. Paris, even after everything, still smells faintly of ink, smoke, and daring. You wander toward the river once more, the day stretching open. You imagine the ghosts of the old city walking beside you, Josephine with her feathers, Cocteau with his cigarette, the nameless dreamers who mistook euphoria for enlightenment. They're quieter now, but they're still here, stitched into the bricks, the bridges, the rhythm of footsteps, because nothing ever truly leaves Paris. It just becomes part of its story. And as the wind picks up, scattering a few leaves across the cobblestones, you realize something. The heroin craze wasn't just about addiction. It was about yearning for escape, for connection, for beauty that didn't fade. The same yearning that drives every human act of creation and self-destruction alike. You look out over the Seine, watching sunlight ripple like liquid gold. Somewhere, a church bell tolls. The sound stretches through the air, soft and forgiving. And in that sound, hear the city whisper not with shame, but with memory. We survived our own desire. Now, let the pace slow. The city's noise fades, leaving only the soft rhythm of your breathing and the faint hush of the river in the distance. You've walked through decades tonight, through music, chaos, beauty, and ruin. Somehow, you're still standing on the bridge, watching it all drift away like mist. The lights of Paris begin to shimmer in your mind's eye, warm gold and gentle blues, reflecting across water that never stops moving. You feel the air cool against your skin, the quiet weight of the night settling around you. The heroin has vanished, the crowds dispersed, the cabarets turned to memory. What's left is the heartbeat, the same one that pulsed beneath every song, every rebellion, every small act of survival. Take one last look at the city's reflection. See how the ripples smooth out, how the noise of history becomes a lullaby. You realize that even in its darkest chapters, Paris never truly lost itself. It just learned to change shape to dream differently. You breathe in. The scent is softer now, rain, old stone, and something almost sweet. You breathe out, slower. The story quiets, the ghosts recede, and as you drift toward sleep, you carry with you the hum of the city that once danced on the edge of oblivion, somehow kept dancing anyway. Sweet dreams.